So without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Charles Marohn, known as Chuck to friends and colleagues, is the founder and president of Strong Towns and the author of Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild American prosperity. He is a professional engineer and a land use planner with 2 decades of experience. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and master of urban and regional planning, both from the University of Minnesota. Chuck currently hosts the Strong Towns podcast and is a primary writer for Strong Towns web content. He has presented Strong Towns concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America, including Pensacola. He is featured in the documentary film Owned, A Tale of Two Americans, and was named one of the 10 most influential urbanists of all time. In addition to being passionate about building a stronger America, he loves playing music, is an obsessive reader, and religiously follows his favorite team, the Minnesota Twins. That is a baseball team for some people who don't know that. Chuck and his wife live with their 2 daughters in their hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. And at this time, I would like to introduce Chuck, who is our keynote speaker. And don't forget to make sure you put your chats down and your questions down in the chat box. Chuck, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Al. I really appreciate it. And it's interesting because as you were giving the invocation, across the street from my office is my church. And at noon every day, they ring the bells. And it was beautiful. So simultaneous with you, we got that here. So it was very poetic. We're going to talk a little bit about how we break out of a housing trap. And I want to take my time to help you to the degree that we can, because this is a difficult thing, understand the water that we're swimming in and how it's affecting us from a housing standpoint, and some of the things that we can do to move out of that. Our mission is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. It's great to be speaking to people in Pensacola, particularly our 2019 strongest town in the universe. So let me explain what I mean by a housing trap. And I'm going to give an analogy with agriculture. If you go back in time, human beings, particularly in the age before agriculture, lived lives that were obviously meaningful, but full of difficulty. You spent most of your day trying to acquire food. It was difficult to do things like art and music and science, because literally like your entire day was spent acquiring food. There have been studies of these types of civilizations, because there are many people who still live this way today. And while there's a lot of beauty in it, there's also a lot of struggle. One of the ways that people dealt with this struggle was to eventually develop agriculture. And what they found with agriculture is that you could now have more people doing other things. Food tending took a certain percent of your population, but now other parts of your population could become things like priests or warriors or scientists or what have you. And so agriculture had an immediate benefit in that it made us more prosperous. The downside of agriculture is that once you can feed a lot of people, pretty soon you have a lot of people. The people who would normally die, not survive, not, in a sense, your society not be fit enough, all of a sudden those people could stick around. They could live longer. They'd have more prosperous lives. We look at this as a very positive thing, but the problem is that now you need to produce even more food because you have even more people. Of course, producing even more food actually creates in your society even more people. And you see that in every step of this trap, you have the noblest of intentions. You have the most positive of outcomes. You have the thing that is very natural and human. We want to help and serve and support our fellow humans. But every instance of doing that creates this obligation to do more and more and more, lest we have some type of societal type of collapse. This in sociological terms or in anthropological terms is called the agriculture trap. We see the same thing in housing. When we look at the New Deal, we look at the Great Depression, what we see is that at the time of the Great Depression, almost all housing finance was local. And because it was local, it was done over short periods of time. You would get a mortgage or a loan. That loan would be a 3-year, 5-year, 7-year with a big balloon on the end. And the reason is because local banks couldn't finance things long-term. They couldn't take that level of risk. And so they would hedge their risk with these shorter term loans. The problem is when we hit the Great Depression and housing prices started to drop precipitously, when those balloons would come due, the banks weren't going to loan you way more money than what your house was worth. And so all of a sudden now, in a depression with high unemployment and stagnating wages and people in desperate economic straits, the banks would say, you need to come up with massive payments, that big balloon payment. Otherwise, your house goes into foreclosure. Of course, the more houses that go into foreclosure, the lower prices go, and it became this downward deflationary spiral that we needed to somehow arrest. How do we do that? Well, we did that by stepping in and saying, hey, the federal government will insure that loan. Let's not make it a 3-year, 5-year, 7-year loan with all the volatility. Let's make it a 30-year mortgage. Let's spread those payments out over a longer period of time. Let's have lower initial payments. Let's make the payments lower so that people can stay in their house and keep housing prices from declining in this deflationary spiral. Let's insure mortgages so that banks can feel more confident. And then let's create a secondary market so that if we have qualifying mortgages, they can be sold off and the banks can actually get rid of that risk altogether. And so the federal government will take that risk. And so the idea was, let's keep more people in their homes. They can make the payments. They're fine doing it. They're just by circumstance getting kicked out of their house. Let's arrest that. Let's stop that downward spiral. And let's allow more and more people to stay in their homes. It's hard to argue that this wasn't a necessary thing. It's hard to argue that this wasn't a good thing that actually helped us stabilize the economy. You see decades later, a competitor, Freddie Mac and other programs, and I'm going to foreshadow a little bit here because what we found is that the things that kept us out of a deflationary spiral in the 1930s, the thing that kept people in their homes, actually after the war became useful tools for growing our economy. As the war was ending, World War II was ending, there was huge concern amongst economists, amongst thinkers at the time, that once we demobilized all these troops, once we shut down all these factories that were building ships and munitions and airplanes and what have you, that we were just going to go right back into the 1930s. We were going to go right back into a deflationary downward spiral. Of course, that's not what happened, right? What happened is that we took all of this capacity to build tanks and munitions and ships and this kind of population that was united against common enemies, along with these tools that we had created to fight economic decline. And we just put all of those to work in building this new version of America. If spreading out payments over a longer period of time, lowering down payments, if that helped people stay in their homes, it would also help people get into new homes. And so we just redirected our entire economy around this new system, this way of growing very, very quickly. And of course, we all are familiar with this story. We grew our cities incredibly fast in this post-World War II era. This is the city of Fresno, California. I use Fresno because we've got great maps, but Fresno really mimics what we see in every city across the United States. Here's the boundaries of Fresno in 1897. Here we go in 1909. You'll see this incremental kind of development pattern. Now we're in the midst of the Great Depression and the end of World War II. Now, look what happens. And we all kind of understand this story. Here's the decades after the war, this post-war expansion, when we had this new version of America grow very, very quickly. What we see is that the expansion of our country horizontally out from our cities became very, very aggressive. And we were able to create a lot of housing in a very quick period of time. If you look at something like my city, I live in Brainerd, Minnesota. It's a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. At the end of World War II, we were 13,500 people. Today, my city is 13,500 people. So no population growth, but we're 10 times the size. We're 10 times the area. This style of development allowed us to create growth very, very quickly, but of course it came with a lot of financial side effects, a lot of financial dead weight, if we want to call it. This is data from Lafayette, Louisiana, which we're going to look at in a little bit more detail here in a minute. But at the end of World War II, Lafayette had a population of a little over 33,000. Today, it's a little over 120,000, a 3.5 times increase. It's a huge amount of growth in that period of time. Yet, if we look at how the people in Lafayette get their water, at the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person. Today, it takes 50 feet of pipe per person to provide clean water for the people of Lafayette. That's a 10 times increase. How about their fire protection? At the end of World War II, it was 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people. Today, it's 21 times that. And so you see that it takes more and more input to get the same amount of growth. It's taking an increase, in a sense, mathematical sense, we would call this diminishing returns. This would be fine, and we could justify this in many ways if our families were becoming richer, if we were being able to own more home, get more people into houses, we were experiencing broader prosperity. That's not what we're seeing in a city like Lafayette, which is very similar to cities all over North America. While we see the community liabilities grow by 10 times and 20 times, what we see is that the median household income and family wealth is not growing anywhere near that amount. We can grow our macro economy very quickly, but at the local level, it's having all kinds of distorting effects. We have tried successively to keep people in their homes, to make homes more affordable to people, to basically go back to that New Deal approach of how do we lower payments? How do we extend payments? How do we lower down payments and get more people into homes by making them more affordable to finance? We've gone through successive periods of this. These are interest rates over time, starting in 1982 until right after the 2008-2009 financial crises. What you see is that as a population, we are saving less, we are borrowing more. In a market economy, if you don't have enough savings and you have a lot of demand for borrowing, interest rates should go up. That's how you attract more savers, and that's how you reduce borrowing. We've actually done the opposite. In order to get people into housing, in order to keep the housing component of our economy, which is a huge part of our economy, going, we have artificially and successively lowered and lowered and lowered interest rates to the point now where we have had over a decade of zero or near zero interest rates. This is the effect on housing prices. And if you look at, I chose this graph here because you can see the 3 little crises that are laid out here. The US savings and loan, the dot-com bubble, the financial crises, they're reflected in this map here as well as the 1970s boom, the 1980s boom, and then the current boom. You see this correlation between interest rates and the boom and bust in the housing market. This is the Case-Shiller Index. For those of you that don't know the Case-Shiller Index, it's based on the novel insight that wages and housing prices are related. So as people make more money, they tend to pay more for housing. As they make less money, they pay less for housing. And so over time, as wages have gone up, housing prices have gone up. And so a ratio between the two stays pretty flat. Before the First World War, you had them in kind of a range bound. There were a couple little bubbles here in the late 1800s around railroad building. After World War I, through the Great Depression, World War II, things stayed very low. In the post-war boom, you had a period of relative stability. Then you get the 1 little bubble, 2 little bubbles, and then the big bubble that we look back at in 2008 as the big bubble, where the Case-Shiller Index suggests that housing was double what we could afford based on our wages. And again, this is not poor people. This is median wages throughout the country. So we can talk about the effect on the very poor and the very disadvantaged. It is this magnified many times over. What we're seeing here is that even people who we would consider middle class or consider in the median of the country are finding housing prices incredibly unaffordable. I want to point out what's happened since that period of time. This is the Case-Shiller Index zoomed in from the 80s. It's funny because when you look at it in this way, the bubble here is very small. Back here, it's a noticeable boom right here, but in this one, it's small. But here's our big run up in the 2000 to 2008 period. We call this a housing bubble. When I ask crowds, what would you call this? Everybody says housing bubble. That's what we've constructed a narrative around that. Yet when we look at what has happened since that period of time, we called this a bubble, but we call this a recovery. No one blows a financial bubble and then, kind of primes off of that peak and says, well, that's the new normal now. The way that finance works is that if something is a bubble and then the bubble deflates, you go back to, quote unquote, normal. That's not what we did. We had a little bit of a deflationary episode, and then we blew that bubble right back up. We are now at epic proportions of unaffordability nationwide in terms of housing, and have created a very tenuous situation for ourselves that we can see in the post-COVID world remains tenuous. We have, in a sense, pegged our housing markets on maximum price appreciation. And people who are buying into it today, even at the median and the above median levels, so people that we would generally as a society think of as middle class or upper middle class, are buying an overappreciated asset on the basis that that asset will continue to appreciate at rates beyond any historical norm. Of course, we have, as part of this process, in a sense, nationalized home building. Habitat for Humanity is one of the few remaining players at the local level who works at a small scale. What we see is that most of our housing is now delivered by large firms backed by Wall Street finance. A lot of the home buying, even of existing homes, is now being done by Wall Street money, by liquidity pumped into the market. I was in the little town of Salida, Colorado, before the pandemic started. And their big issue was housing affordability. And it was fascinating because the marginal buyer, and this is a place that took, I flew somewhere remote, took 3 flights to get there, drove an hour to get to this little town. So it's not like this is a very accessible place. Very beautiful, yes, but not very accessible. The marginal buyer there, the buyer who is buying up 5% of the properties and driving the prices up to levels that were absurd for the local economy, was all driven by Wall Street money. It was all people coming in and looking to park money somewhere. And real estate, in that sense, looked like a better investment than anything else they could get into. It's important to note that with all of this effort into pumping up housing prices and making housing prices, go up as a way to keep our economy going, that we do have this kind of structural problem now that we have created. We have to keep this bubble up, otherwise our economy implodes. Yet the mechanisms for keeping it there are not clear. This is a population pyramid. So you're looking at the left of males and the right females as a percentage of the millions of people in the population. You can see this big group right here that I've highlighted. Those are the millennials. This group here is the baby boomers. I live in that little range of forgotten people in between. But nonetheless, it's these two groups that are driving the economics of our country. The interesting thing about housing is that that top group needs to sell their housing at artificially high prices to the people in the bottom group. Who are those people in the bottom group? What is their life like? They are broke. They have high college debt. They have low savings rates. They have had delayed careers because as soon as they got out of college, they had to deal with the 2008 crisis. They've never really had a real recovery from that. Now they're dealing with a pandemic and a second economic crisis. They're overeducated in the sense that they are competing for fewer and fewer high-paying jobs with more and more people. And so you have this breakdown where the handoff from the upper group to the bottom group is not very clear. And that would be optimistic if the bottom group actually wanted the housing that the top group has. There's a real gap in terms of the desire of that bottom group to live in the housing owned by the top group. And so we have, this kind of structural problem that is, I think, grinding this thing to a head. This all leads me to this slide here, which I shared this once a couple of years ago, and people stood up and took photos of it, which is how you know you've got a good slide. This just notion of who benefits from high housing prices, because when we listen to people, we all talk about, we would like housing to be affordable. We would like prices to be accessible to people. We'd like to get people into houses. But what that typically means is that we would like to create ways for people to take on debt, ways for people to finance housing, ways for us to, tax people or rent control developers or gouge someone else, because really, we don't want housing prices to go down. If you're a local government and a huge amount of your tax receipts is based on property tax, the last thing you want is for housing prices to go down. If you're the state and federal government and the whole housing market is how you're financing, 20, 25% of your revenue, you do not want prices to go down. If you own a home, or you are a bank who has a mortgage on a home, or an insurance company, you do not want housing prices to go down. If you're a developer, contractor, land speculator, rising housing prices has bailed you out so many times. When you've done a bad deal or had something go wrong, you just wait a little bit and the appreciation kind of solves your problem for you. You do not want housing prices to go down. If you are running a pension fund, the last thing you want is for housing in America to go back to a market price, to go back to a price that people could afford. So there is, a desire that we all have to have housing be affordable for people. But that desire conflicts with this essential need we have to have housing prices stay stable, or preferably to continue to rise. Who doesn't benefit from this? People who don't own homes, people who rent, the poor, the disadvantaged, the people, on the one side of the seesaw there. This is, I think, the difficulty we have, because I think we can all have very good intentions here, but when the options on the table are all options that have to continue the current high level of housing prices in order for our systems to work, it actually takes 90+% of the options off the table and leaves us with very few. What this has had the effect of doing, and I'm going to give you a Minnesota analogy here. So I realize in Pensacola, you don't have to deal with snow. Sometimes I think you've had black ice, maybe a time or two. The idea when you're driving on snow is that you want to not overcorrect, because what happens is you do a little bit of a correction, your car will start to slide a little bit. If you then overcorrect, you're done, because the car will start to swerve, you overcorrect, it swerves more, you overcorrect, it swerves more, and pretty soon it's spinning out of control. Housing in our country, when you look back at the history, we tried to correct. And that correction created a system where we overcorrected the other way, and we overcorrected the other way. And now we're sitting here with this crazy spinning around and around, where we have interest rates at zero. You can get a home mortgage, with a very low down payment, with payments insured by the federal government, with the Federal Reserve buying up those mortgages so the banks take on very low interest rates. You can get that at 3% or sub 3%. I saw the other day. We have used all the tools that we have to get more and more people into elevated housing prices. And that game is not working. That system feels very much like it is broke and it is about to fall apart. What I want to help you do beyond recognizing that is break out of that system. We are not going to, in Pensacola, we're not going to in Brainerd, change the housing market. The housing market is federalized. It's going to be given to us. It's going to be bequeathed to us and passed down. What we can do is carve out a healthy niche and put ourselves in a position to survive whatever kind of transition is coming. Housing, at the end of the day, should be and has historically been, until we made it the center of our growth strategy, over the last 70 years, 80 years, housing has been part of a complex adaptive system. When I say complex adaptive system, I want you to think of like a rainforest. We understand that a rainforest is made up of many different types of flora and fauna. They all interact in complex ways. When we look at a rainforest, we realize it's not ordered, that the order of the rainforest is emergent. It emerges from all these complex adaptations. This is the way that housing has traditionally worked. Housing has been part of a complex adaptive system. It's not just finance. It's not just your ability to afford. It's part of a broader culture. It's part of a broader environment. There are so many things that affect where people build, when they build, what they build. These are complex adaptive systems. If you think of a complex adaptive system, it's different than a system that is merely complicated. Complicated systems like a machine, a Rube Goldberg machine. A Rube Goldberg machine, the novelty of it is that it's complicated. There's a lot of things going on. But if you cut one of these ropes or move one of these blocks, the Rube Goldberg machine doesn't adapt. It doesn't evolve and change. It doesn't meet new conditions. It just breaks. It just stops working. If you think of your automobile engine, it's a very complicated machine, but if you stress it too much, if you put it through too much stress, it doesn't evolve and adapt and change to new circumstances. It doesn't become a toaster or a wash machine. It just stops being a car engine. It just breaks. This is the difference between systems that are complex and systems that are merely complicated. Complex systems adapt and evolve. If a rainforest gets a lot of rain or a lot of sun, it doesn't fail, it doesn't stop, it adapts and changes. When you look at a cornfield, which is a system that is merely complicated, give it too much rain, give it too much sun, and it doesn't evolve and become soybeans, it doesn't adapt and become potatoes, it just becomes bad corn, it just stops working. The same thing goes with housing. When we build complex systems that are adaptive, that respond to people and people's needs, the ability to afford a house, the ability to maintain a house, what we see is that these systems develop a complex, adaptive, emergent nature. When we build the same thing over and over and over, when we have the same financing system, when we have the same building system, when we have the same exact approach, what we see is that, yes, we can build very efficiently, we can build a lot, but when things stop working, we lack the ability to evolve and adapt and see new systems emerge. What we need at the local level is to start nudging our systems back, start moving our systems back into being complex. This is the way cities have always been built. This is my hometown, Brainerd, Minnesota, back in 1870. This is the very first iteration. And if we went back to Pensacola, there was a very first iteration of Pensacola as well. And it looked very much like this, just a series of little pop-up shacks. These were some hopes and some dreams about the future. Understand the dynamics of a place like this. You would have people who basically were speculating. They would come out to the middle of nowhere. They would go to Pensacola before it was a place, and they would build some little pop-up shacks like this. And they would hope that if enough people moved there, it would become more of a place. And when it became more of a place, the actual land would start to increase in value. And that increase in value of the land, combined with the declining value of these little pop-up shacks, would create a redevelopment scenario where now you could justify building a bigger, a more expensive, a more valuable place. And if you look 30 years later, that's exactly what happened. This is the same exact street as the pop-up shacks, but it's 30 years later. As more and more people moved here, the land becomes more valuable. The buildings are built cheaply at first, a little bit better at second. But then over time, as the land value goes up and the buildings become worth less in relation to the land, you see even more redevelopment. This is the same street 40 years later. Those wood buildings are now replaced by buildings of brick and granite, substantial structures that will last a century or more. This is the style of development we see in cities all over the world. This is a complex, adaptive system where cities are not built all at once to a finished state, the way we build them today, kind of locked in stasis, but they're built and designed with an understanding that they will evolve and adapt to meet the changing economics and the changing needs of the people that are there. In case you're wondering, this is what the street looks like today. As we ran the highway through the middle of town, we knocked out those property values, the underlying land values. Without the rising land values, basically with land values everywhere kind of equilibrate at a lower level, what we did is we killed that redevelopment cycle. And you can see, a street like this has lost its buildings. It's become a collection of vacant properties and parking lots. This is the kind of devaluation we see with the current kind of build it and they will come style of development. If you take a look at these two lots, you'll see on the left that traditional style. These were built in the 1920s. The little pop-up shack on the edge of town. You had hoped at the time that things would continue to improve. You'd eventually get second and third stories. That's not what happened. We ran the highway. That's the highway just right along here through the middle of the city. Kind of drove away that complex adaptive nature, became all about the complicated, not the complex. So remove the adaptation. And 70 years later, the city has seen no change in this block. The block on the right used to look just like it. We got it torn down and now redeveloped with something new. It took almost 3 decades of tax subsidy guarantees to make this transition happen. That would be sad enough. But what we see is that even without the tax subsidy, we have a massive devaluation of the property. The property on the left, these old, blighted, rundown, nasty looking buildings that the city has labeled as blight, actually have more value, more wealth, more opportunity for the community than the one on the right. This is a theme that I want to double down on, because what we see today, and this is a map of Lafayette, Louisiana, what you're looking at here is the profit and loss of each parcel within the city. Every place where you see a blue property, that property pays more in taxes and fees on an annual basis to the city than it costs to provide service and maintenance. Everywhere where you see red is the exact opposite. These places cost more to service and maintain than they provide in wealth to the community. What we see today is that our most profitable neighborhoods are also generally correlated with our poorest neighborhoods. The blue neighborhoods in this map are the ones on the right here. The red neighborhoods, of course, look like these ones on the left. The built all at once to a finished state type of places. On the right, you have the traditional pattern of development. You have these old places that are designed to evolve, designed to adapt. And even in their rundown, dilapidated state, even in their neglected condition, they still financially outperform the stuff that we're building brand new today. The stuff on the left is growth. It creates jobs. It creates immediate tax benefits. It creates cash, but it also creates these enormous long-term liabilities. You saw that in the Lafayette data I showed you earlier, where now it takes 10 times, the amount of pipe to provide water service, 25 times the amount, or 21 times the amount of hydrants. The stuff on the left is very expensive to service and maintain, and over time is a financial noose around the community's neck. If we're going to start complex adaptive reuse, it's going to start in places that look like the right, that stuff on the right. How do we do that in a way that is respectful, that brings people along with us, that keeps people in their homes, and that builds wealth in those neighborhoods? I'm going to give you a few steps. These are kind of universal ideas that we've developed at Strong Towns. The first one is we have to allow everywhere at all times the next increment of intensity by right. The idea that you can go from a small shack to a large house to a more finished street, those steps need to be allowed by right. And by right, what I mean is that you should be able to walk into City Hall at 9 a.m. with a completed permit application and then walk out by noon with a permit. You shouldn't have to go to public hearings. You shouldn't have to beg your neighbors. If you have a single family home, you should be able to turn it into a duplex without, any real regulatory friction in making that happen. As a corollary, or as a statement that goes along with that, we always share this insight from Strong Towns. No neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood can be exempt from change. What we have often come to as a solution to affordability is stuff like this. The idea that what we will do to make houses affordable is we'll deliver them at scale, en masse. And this is essentially taking our current financing system, which likes to work in large increments, which likes to work with lots of liquidity, which is financed, through these large corporations from central places, and saying, we can deliver this en masse. Let's do that. And what we see is that as a compromise in our community, we will say, all right, 90% of our neighborhoods or 95% of our neighborhoods, don't worry about it. You're not going to experience any change at all. But 5% of our neighborhoods are going to be completely unrecognizable tomorrow. It's going to change overnight. And this has created not only a lot of social tension, but a lot of financial and economic tension. I want to walk you through a little scenario here. Let's say you own this vacant lot between these two buildings. On the left, you've got a single family home. On the right, you've got a condo building. How much do you sell your vacant lot for? Your lot's for sale, you're going to sell it. How much do you sell it? Well, you look at the single family home on the left and you see it's worth $200,000. You look at the condo building on the right, you see it's worth $10 million. How do you value that vacant lot? Well, you would understand that, the land portion of that single family home is about $30,000. The land portion of that condo unit is about $1.5 million. And so you ask yourself, do I foresee a single family home being built on my vacant lot, or do I foresee a condo unit? Would I rather have 30,000 or 1.5 million? Well, I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. I'd rather it be a condo unit. And so the value of that lot becomes 1.5 million. That's what I put it up for sale, because I know that a developer can come in and the highest and best use will drive that. Okay, that's fine. That's the market as we've created it, right? What's that single family home worth now? It's not worth 200,000 anymore. It's worth something else. And not only is it worth something else, but it's not worth anything to improve. If the roof starts to go bad, if the renter in there is complaining about the plumbing, why would I go in and fix any of that? All the value is now in the land, and it's artificially in the land. It's not really in the land, it's artificially in the land. And it's artificially in the land because of the way we've chosen to develop, because we've developed in large leaps. This is an unhealthy way for our communities to grow. And so when we say no neighborhood should experience radical change, no neighborhood should be exempt from change, what we're suggesting is that we need to recreate that organic growth, that feedback loop, the complex adaptive system that allows our neighborhoods to start to respond to the people who are there. We need to lower the bar of entry. We need to make it easier, not for people to finance homes and get into longer mortgages and basically, take on more and more commitment. We actually need to make it easier for people to build a house. This is something in my community we call a tiny home. My ancestors would have called this a home. We've added the word tiny for some reason, and I really don't know why, because what this really is a starter home. I can go around the neighborhoods in my community and I can find houses that began as 400, 500, 600 square foot homes. These are not easy to finance today. There's not really a market for them on the secondary market. You're not going to get D.R. Horton come in and build a bunch of these. Yet this is the exact type of home that everybody used to start with 100 years ago. You would build a small little house. You would borrow a little bit of money maybe, but not much. When you had a kid, you would put an addition on the back. When you got a raise at work, you would put it on a second story. You can go around to your older neighborhoods and see the evolution of these places. We can get more people into homes by lowering the bar of entry. We also have to change the way we invest in these neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that are struggling, the neighborhoods that we want to see come back, the neighborhoods that have the highest potential for these complex adaptive feedback loops. We actually need to shift our public investment strategy from being top down to being very bottom up. We need to actually go out and respond to how people are using the city. If we want complex adaptive feedback, we have to be providing that ourselves. At Strong Towns, we have created a 4-step approach to making these types of public investments. Step number 1, go out and humbly observe where people in the community struggle. Go out and with humility, observe, walk with people, talk to them, experience the city as they are experiencing it, and try to understand from their perspective where they are struggling with it today. Step number 2, ask the question, what is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? Not what is the big ultimate solution, not how do we solve this for all time, but what is the thing we can do with straw bales and duct tape and paint and cones to help make this a little bit better right now? Step 3, go do that thing. Do it immediately. Don't hire a consultant. Don't debate it for 6 months. It's just a small little thing. Go out and do it. And then the 4th step is to repeat this process over and over and over and over. Jane Jacobs called cities co-creations, things we build together. And in this post, New Deal, post World War II era, cities have increasingly become something that we pay for, something that we just sign up for. We pay our mortgage, we pay our rent, we pay our taxes, and we expect someone to deliver for us. This is not how complex adaptive systems work. This is not how successful systems work. And we can see more and more people getting priced out of that approach. We need to get back to our cities as co-creations, as things we build together. And we start that process by identifying where people struggle. We can continue on this path, this kind of top-down path where we try to solve every problem with a big program, a big initiative, a big spending here, or a debt financing thing here. This is Lawton, Oklahoma, a city I spent some time in. I like the people here. It made me sad that they got a big, $20 million Tiger Grant program to come in and put decorative streetlights and decorative sidewalks and all this stuff, when really you can look here, and what the problem is they don't have a place. They actually start building a place instead of trying to impose one. We can continue on this path and not really respond to the struggles and the needs of people. Or we can humble ourselves to ask a different set of questions. How do we make this stuff more accessible? How do we actually lower the bar of entry? How do we create feedback loops that will equilibrate prices and markets to what people can actually afford to pay? You see examples of this in places like Memphis, Tennessee. It's a little Broad Avenue project where they went out and humbled themselves to observe where people struggled, took little steps to make it better, and have seen huge results, huge returns as a result. I'm going to pause and take some questions, but I want to just lean into this overarching theme here that the systems that we are working in were set up to solve a very specific problem in the 1930s. It's a problem that needed to be solved and needed to be addressed. But the atrophy or the magnification of that system over decades and decades and decades and decades has become a monster. It's become a thing unto itself. And if we want to start to create some sensibility in our housing approach, if we want to create a market that actually responds to the people in our communities and their needs, we're going to have to be proactive and step up and do that ourselves. So Al, Marcy, I'm not sure who is going to point us to the right questions, but I'm happy to hang out and take some here and do what I can.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for that presentation. I mean, you walked us down memory lane and then had some very comparative things that we can look at and identify what systems were put in place and how we move from complex adaptive systems to a complex, more systems that is not compatible with what we need for today. So what I do have here are some questions that are up, and I want to read them for you. What do you believe to be the greatest barrier to achieving social equity and affordability in housing?
I think right now it's that everybody has to play by the rules of the essentially the Wall Street, Washington, D.C. rules. So if you look right now, success is how do we get you into a 30-year mortgage? You're close enough to New Orleans, where I think this example will be personal to some people. If you look at New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, one of the things that they found is that they could go in and give people double what their properties were worth. You go in and say, okay, your house is condemned. It was only worth $80,000. We'll give you $150,000. But you couldn't rebuild a house for $150,000. It was going to cost you $250,000 or $300,000. And so what happened is that the people who had incrementally built that city and who owned a house that was $80,000 and had inherited from family and didn't have to work a 40-hour a week, 9 to 5 corporate job because they didn't have a mortgage. They didn't have, they lived a lifestyle that was not that lifestyle, basically got that taken away from them. And the result was, no, you're going to enter the system now. You're going to have to get a mortgage. You're going to have to get a full-time job. You're going to have to live a different life. You're going to have to become basically a part of this finance machine. And a lot of them, it totally transformed New Orleans in ways that they're still struggling to recover from. So I think it's the fact that we have said everyone must play by these rules. You're going to either be part of an ownership society where you're going to have a 30-year mortgage and you're going to make payments on that, or you don't get to play the game. And I think that has no real historic basis and is brutally unfair to lots and lots of people who that's not their lifestyle. And that's not the way they're going to function in society.
Well, thank you much for that answer, sir. I want to encourage everyone to make sure you put your questions in the chat box, and I'll try to get to them as quickly as possible. I have another one here. How would you equate walkability or bikeability to neighborhoods that may be more or less suited for evolution or growth?
It's a really good question. I'm going to take it in two different directions. Direction number one is when you look at neighborhoods that hold their value and also have the most explosive increases in cost, they tend to be neighborhoods that are walkable. And so when we talk about things like gentrification and, coming into a neighborhood and transforming it, when I showed you those large investments where you're taking dilapidated houses and putting the condo unit next to them, people who are doing that tend to look for neighborhoods that are walkable because that's where those types of investments are easiest to make and have the broadest market penetration. On the other hand, there are a lot of neighborhoods that are on the borderline of being walkable or are walkable, where small improvements in them or small changes in them, fixing a crosswalk here, adding some trees over there, patching up some broken sidewalks, would have real noticeable gains in quality of life for the people who live there. And the reality is that if you live in a neighborhood where you can have one car instead of two, what you've done is by having that family only have the burden of one car instead of two cars, you've given them another $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 a year that they can spend on savings, spend on their improving their house, spend on their security and stability. If you require them in order to, as an ante, participate in your society, you have to own two cars. Now all of a sudden you put a tremendous financial burden on them. So to me, the low-hanging fruit for liberating families and allowing people of modest and limited means full access to society is to create neighborhoods that are intrinsically walkable and allow them the opportunity to own a car or not, to bike somewhere or not, to walk somewhere or not. Give them options. And if you give them options, now they can make multiple choices. And that's when I say complex adaptive systems, what I'm talking about is give people multiple choices and they will adapt and change based on their circumstances.
Thank you, sir, for that. Just want to remind attendees to put those questions in the Q&A. We got a ton of questions coming through. Want to ask a few more. I got one here that talks about what are some examples of short-term solutions that have had successful in other cities, that were successful in other cities, that may be able to be easily translated to solutions for Pensacola?
There's two parts of that question that my brain hangs up with, and I think if we were all in person talking for a long time, we could work through this. The first one is a short term. I don't know. The other one is solutions. So let me deal with those together. I, I, I think when we think of things as complicated and not complex, what you're thinking of is I have the problem in front of me. How do I solve it? And then there's another problem, and how do I solve it? And those tend to be short-term solutions. I want you to think of housing as a complex adaptive system. And in a complex adaptive system, there really aren't problems or solutions because nothing's ever solved. What there is ongoing evolution and change. There's adaptation. What we really want is we want our housing markets to respond to the people who are there. So if people are making less money, you actually want housing prices to come down. If people are making more money, housing prices can go up. You want them to respond to a local market. If there's not enough single family housing, let's build more of that. If there's not enough accessory apartments, let's build more of that. And so I want our thinking to evolve beyond, problem solution, because there are no solutions, and more into how do we make this thing more responsive to us as a community, as opposed to responsive to outside forces and outside markets. That being said, a couple of the quickest things that I think you can do to start that process go towards accessory apartments, accessory dwelling units, basically allowing people to convert their garages into a house, convert their basement into a duplex unit, basically allow people more flexibility to take the next step in building wealth and value in their house. This allows people to stay in their homes. The kind of quintessential case, there's many ways of thinking of this, but think of the widow who now doesn't have the income to maintain the house. And so that person can either lose the house to the bank, sell the house and move, or maybe they can take the spare room that they're not using anymore, or the other, the lower level that they're not using anymore, and convert that into a duplex and rent it out. And now use that rental income to stay in the house and maintain it. That was an option that was available for people for thousands of years that we have taken away through zoning, through building controls, that we can just give back to people and give them those options to build their own wealth and create their own stability and security.
Thank you, sir, for that. Got a couple more questions if we have time here. One talks about the infrastructure and disinvestment. And it says, how often does infrastructure disinvestment or neglect play a role in a neighborhood?
I feel like it follows a natural cycle, right? Today, the way we build is we build things all at once and we build it to a finished state. So think of your residential subdivision that was built in the early 2000s. If you go out there today, that thing is now 15, 20 years old. You can start to see a little bit of wear and aging, but it's probably the nicer neighborhood. It's got nicer sidewalks, nicer streets, nicer pipe. It's all maintained. It's all brand new. Now go to the place that was built in the 1970s or 1980s. And what you see is that that's gone through an iteration. When you build 100 homes at the same time in the same subdivision, 30 years later, everybody's roof goes bad at the same time. Everybody's sidewalk falls apart at the same time in the whole neighborhood. Everybody's refrigerator goes bad at the same time in the whole neighborhood. So all at once, this neighborhood experiences decline simultaneously. And, you're not giving any means to arrest that decline. You can't take your single family home, convert it into a duplex, use that cash flow to fix things up. You're either going to maintain it or not. And so what happens is that the affluent people in that declining neighborhood move to the new neighborhood. And what you see is that neighborhoods get stuck in a cycle of decline. And it really has to do with their age. It's not really government policy. Government policy kind of reflects it, because the neighborhoods that are new with the new developers and the wealthier people can get the attention. The older neighborhoods where people are more disenfranchised and where there isn't that wealth tend to, fall to the side because there isn't anyone really advocating for them. And so it becomes like a self-reinforcing cycle that's built into the system from the start because of how we built them, designed them as complicated machines, not as complex adaptive systems.
Thank you, sir. Looks like we have time for perhaps one more question I want to throw out there. What approaches will be needed for the ALICE population that are not benefiting from the high home costs to those in this environment?
Al, say that again. I'm not following that one completely.
Yeah, I was trying to read. What approaches would be needed for the ALICE population that are not benefiting from the high home costs to thrive in this environment? So you're talking about low-income families.
Yeah.
And how do they benefit? I think earlier you kind of touched a little bit on it about giving them the opportunity to adapt. So maybe perhaps along those lines.
I think that there has to be a recognition of two things. The first is that our current system is not designed for them. And so if we try to, and this is not a knock on Habitat, because what I admire most about Habitat for Humanity is that you've taken a system that I think is really difficult to work in terms of providing homes for people of limited means. You have taken that system and you've done miracles with it. And it's a really difficult job to do. If we want to do that at scale, if we want to do that with more and more people, I mean, I think organizations like Habitat, short-term programs, I've seen rent control programs and other programs that I think over the long term are really destructive, but as a short-term response, as kind of like a transition response, can maybe help alleviate some of the peaks and some of the most difficult parts of this. But ultimately, what we need to do is we need to almost protect those neighborhoods from the large distortions, the large changes that price people out, and then allow more flexibility within those neighborhoods for people to get started in smaller homes, to get started in accessory units, to convert their houses into multiple units so that they can rent one out or sell one separately. We basically need to give people more options to start small and allow them to build their own wealth. When I say lower the bar to entry, some people sometimes interpret that as a bad thing. Don't. If you're saying the bar to entry is you must be able to qualify for a 30-year mortgage, and that means you must have a credit score of 720 or above. That means you must have a 40-hour-a-week job and have had that for the last 2 years. That means you must, have a credit card history that's positive. You've got all these that's what you got to do to play the game. What I'm saying is that there's a whole lot of people who can't play that game, who are really good citizens, who have a lot to contribute, who want to be part of this system. And so we need to have a place where they can enter the game, enter the system that we have, and fully participate without meeting that barrier. And the more we can do that, I think the more opportunity we're going to provide to everybody.
Well, sir, thank you for that response. We definitely thank you for taking the time out to come and participate in our summit here today. I know that you have a prior engagement that you have to get to, but
I do. Thank you.
So if there go ahead.
I just want to say thank you. And I do admire the work you're doing, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and be part of this conversation. And I really do hope to get to Pensacola again very soon, because it's one of my favorite places. So thank you.
Well, sir, you are always welcome. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.